I think it's a man's responsibility to protect that relationship. And I didn't do that. Like I said, I was too driven, I guess, or whatever.
It was a small, quiet hospital room, and it didn't feel like a place where a legend would make his last stand. Kenny Rogers was tired, and his voice wasn't what it used to be, but he had one more song left in him. He sat there, hooked up to machines, recording a final duet that would break everyone's heart. It was raw, it was real, and it was the perfect, sad ending to a massive life. Rogers's last duet was recorded in a hospital room, and it was just so sad. The hospital session. When you think of a recording studio, you think of expensive soundproofing, fancy mood lighting, and those big glass windows that separate the singer from the producer. You think of comfort and perfection. But Kenny Rogers' last time in front of a microphone wasn't like that at all. It was stripped down, it was uncomfortable, and it was deeply human. He wasn't standing on a stage in front of thousands of screaming fans, and he wasn't wearing one of those sharp suits he was famous for. Instead, he was in a hospital bed, surrounded by the hum of medical equipment and the smell of sterile hallways. It was a place meant for healing, but it became the place where he said his final goodbye through music. Recording a song in a hospital is a logistical nightmare, but for Kenny, it was the only way. His body was failing him, but his mind was still on the craft. He had agreed to do a duet with a close friend, and even though he could barely catch his breath, he refused to let the song go unfinished. The engineers had to bring the equipment to him. They set up mobile mics and laptops right there next to the IV stands and the monitors. There was no room for ego. There was only the work. Everyone in the room knew how heavy the moment was. They knew they weren't just recording a track for a new album. They were capturing the last embers of a fire that had been burning for over 60 years. The song was a duet, which was fitting because Kenny's career was built on the way he played off other people. But this time, the energy was different. Usually, Kenny's voice was like velvet, smooth, deep, and effortless. In that hospital room, the velvet was frayed. You could hear the age in his throat. You could hear the physical struggle in every line. He had to stop often. He had to rest. Sometimes his voice would crack, or he'd have to wait for a coughing fit to pass. But he didn't want to hide that. He wanted the take to be honest. He knew he didn't have the power he used to have, but he still had the soul. That's what makes this recording so hard to listen to today. You aren't hearing a superstar. You're hearing a man who knows his time is up, trying to leave one last gift behind. The people in the room tried to keep things professional, but the air was thick with sadness. Every time Kenny reached for a note, it felt like he was pulling it from his very core. He wasn't singing for the charts anymore. He wasn't thinking about radio play or Grammys. He was singing because it was the only way he knew how to deal with the end. When he finally finished his parts, there was a long silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows a great performance at a concert hall. It was the kind of quiet that happens when everyone realizes they've just witnessed something they'll never see again. They had the recording, but they also had the realization that the man who had defined country music for generations was finally putting down the pen. It's a strange thing, listening to a voice that sounds so fragile when you're used to it sounding so strong. But that's the beauty of this last session. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being there. He stayed until the job was done. He made sure the duet was finished. When the equipment was packed up and the room went back to being just a regular hospital room, the legacy was sealed. He had played his final hand, and he had played it with everything he had left. It was a heartbreaking scene, but it was also a brave one. He didn't fade away in silence. He went out singing, even if his voice was just a whisper of what it once was. Before the lights grew dim in that hospital room, they were just starting to flicker in the heat of Texas. The Houston roots. Kenny Rogers wasn't born with a silver spoon or a gold record in his hand. He came from the kind of place that teaches you how to work hard because there simply isn't any other choice. Growing up in Houston, Texas, during the 40s and 50s, Kenny lived in a federal housing project. Money was tight and life was basic, but the air was always filled with music. He was one of 8 kids, so he learned pretty early on how to stand out and how to be heard. But back then, he wasn't thinking about being a country music king. He was just a kid in a poor neighborhood trying to figure out a way to make life a little more interesting. His first real dive into music wasn't through a guitar or a cowboy hat, it was through jazz. Most people don't realize that the man who sang The Gambler actually started out playing the upright bass in a jazz group called the Bobby Doyle Three. He was young, he had a thick head of dark hair, and he was learning the ropes of the music business in smoky clubs and small lounges. This is where he learned the most important lesson of his career: how to connect with an audience. In those small rooms, if you didn't grab people's attention, you didn't eat. He watched how people reacted to different notes and different stories. He was a student of the room long before he was a star of the stage. Eventually, the jazz scene started to shift, and so did Kenny. He moved into the world of folk and rock with a group called The First Edition. This was the late 60s, a time when the world was changing fast, and the music was changing with it. You can still see the old footage of him from this era. He had long hair, an earring, and pink-tinted sunglasses. He looked like a hippie, not a country crooner. When they released Just Dropped In to See What Condition My Condition Was In, it was a psychedelic hit. It was weird, it was catchy, and it proved that Kenny had a voice that could handle almost anything. He wasn't stuck in one lane. He was a chameleon who knew how to adapt to whatever the world wanted to hear. But being in a band is hard. Tensions rose, the hits started to dry up, and eventually, the group fell apart. At that point, Kenny was in his mid-30s, which is usually considered old in the music industry. Most people would have packed it in and found a regular job back in Houston. He was broke, he was divorced, and he was starting over from scratch. But that Texas grit kicked in. He decided to head to Nashville, even though he didn't really consider himself a country singer at the time. He just knew he had a voice and a knack for telling stories. Those early years in Houston and the grind of the 60s were the foundation for everything that came later. He wasn't an overnight success. He was a guy who had spent 20 years in the trenches before he ever saw a massive paycheck. He knew what it felt like to play for 5 people, and he knew what it felt like to wonder where the next gig was coming from. That's why, even when he became a superstar, he always seemed like a guy you could grab a beer with. He never forgot those housing projects or those jazz clubs. He wasn't just a singer anymore, he was a storyteller who found his voice in the dirt of Nashville. Reinventing country. When Kenny Rogers rolled into Nashville in the mid-70s, he was basically a gamble himself. He was a guy in his late 30s with a background in jazz and psychedelic rock, trying to break into a town that was very protective of its old-school traditions. At the time, country music was in a weird spot. It was either very traditional or very pop-focused, and there wasn't a lot of room for someone who didn't fit the mold. But Kenny didn't care about the mold. He brought a sense of production and a gravelly, soulful rasp that the genre hadn't really heard before. He wasn't just singing about trucks and heartbreak, he was singing cinematic stories that felt like movies you could hear. The turning point came with Lucille. It was a song about a guy in a bar and a woman leaving her husband, which sounds like a standard country trope, but the way Kenny sang it made it a global phenomenon. It wasn't just a hit on the country charts, it crossed over to the pop charts too. This was the beginning of the Kenny Rogers era, where he basically rewrote the rules for what a country star could look like. He brought a level of polish and showmanship that Nashville hadn't seen. He wasn't just playing honky-tonks, he was selling out arenas. He proved that country music didn't have to be niche, it could be for everyone, from housewives in the suburbs to truckers on the road. Then came The Gambler. If Lucille opened the door, The Gambler blew the house down. That song became more than just a piece of music. It became his entire identity. It gave people advice they actually wanted to follow. You've got to know when to hold 'em, know when to fold 'em. It was a philosophy for life, and Kenny delivered it with the wisdom of a man who had actually lived it. By the time the late 70s rolled around, Kenny was one of the biggest stars on the planet. He was winning Grammys and CMA awards, and he was doing it on his own terms. He was the king of the crossover, a term that used to be a dirty word in Nashville until Kenny showed everyone how much money and fame it could bring. What really set him apart during this time was his ability to pick songs. Kenny always said he wasn't the greatest singer or the greatest writer, but he was a great listener. He knew how to find a story that would hit people right in the chest. He worked with the best producers and wasn't afraid to use strings, big choirs, or modern sounds that traditionalists hated. He was building a brand before people even used that word. He was the silver-haired guy with the friendly smile who felt like a neighbor, even though he was making millions. He made country music feel cool and accessible to people who had never set foot in the South. By the end of the decade, Kenny Rogers had successfully reinvented himself and the genre he had joined. He took the rough edges of country and smoothed them out just enough to make them shine. But he never lost the honesty that made the music work in the first place. He was the bridge between the old legends like Johnny Cash and the new stadium superstars. He showed that you could be a country singer and still be a global icon. He had played his cards perfectly, and for a few years there, it felt like the man could do no wrong. He had found his place, and the world was finally singing along. Kenny knew that some stories were too big to tell alone. The power of the duet. If you look at the history of Kenny Rogers, you'll see that he was never a man who wanted to stand on an island. Even when he was the biggest star in the world, he understood that there was a special kind of magic that happened when two voices clicked. He became the undisputed king of the duet, and he had this incredible ability to make whoever he was singing with look like the most important person in the room. He wasn't trying to outshine his partners, he was trying to create a conversation. Whether he was singing with a country queen or a pop diva, Kenny's gravelly tone was the perfect anchor for any melody. He knew that a good duet wasn't just about hitting the right notes, it was about chemistry. And Kenny had plenty of it to go around. The partnership everyone remembers most, of course, is the one he had with Dolly Parton. When they got together for Islands in the Stream in 1983, they didn't just record a hit song, they created a moment in pop culture history. The song was written by the Bee Gees, which shows you just how far Kenny had moved away from the traditional Nashville sound. It was a pop masterpiece, but it worked because Kenny and Dolly felt like best friends who just happened to be singing. Their bond was real, and you could hear it in every line. They laughed together, they poked fun at each other, and they supported each other for decades. That song went to #1 across the board, proving that Kenny's voice was the ultimate bridge between different worlds of music. But it wasn't just Dolly. Kenny had a long and successful run of duets with Dottie West, a woman who helped him find his footing in country music when he was still the new guy from the first edition. Songs like Every Time Two Fools Collide and Anyone Who Isn't Me Tonight showed a more vulnerable side of Kenny. With Dottie, he sounded like a man who had been through the ringer and came out the other side with a few stories to tell. They won awards together and toured together, and their voices blended so naturally that people often wondered if they were a couple in real life. They weren't, but that was the power of Kenny's performance. He made you believe the story every single time. He also stepped outside of the country world to work with people like Sheena Easton on We've Got Tonight and Kim Carnes on Don't Fall in Love with a Dreamer. Each time, Kenny managed to adapt his style to fit the vibe of the song without losing who he was. He was the ultimate collaborator. He understood that a duet is like a short play. You have to play your part and let the other person play theirs. He never stepped on anyone's toes. In fact, many artists said that singing with Kenny made them better because he was such a steady professional presence. He brought out the best in his partners because he was so comfortable in his own skin. Later in his life, these duets took on a deeper meaning. They became a way for him to stay connected to his peers and to the fans who had grown up listening to these pairings. Even when his health started to decline, the idea of the duet remained central to who he was as an artist. That's why that final recording in the hospital room was so significant. It wasn't a solo track, it was a duet. It was Kenny doing what he did best, reaching out and connecting with another human being through a song. He started his career in a band, he made his biggest hits with friends, and he ended his journey the same way. He was a man who knew that life, just like music, is always better when you have someone to share the mic with. Beyond the music, he became the face of a lifestyle, cool, collected, and always holding an ace. The gambler's persona. By the 80s, Kenny Rogers wasn't just a guy with a few hits on the radio. He was a full-blown icon. He had managed to do something that very few musicians ever pull off. He became a character that people felt they actually knew. Because of the song The Gambler, the world stopped seeing him as just Kenny and started seeing him as this wise, mysterious traveler who knew the secrets of life. He leaned into it too. He didn't just sing the song and move on, he turned it into a brand. He grew out that iconic silver beard, wore the vests and the long coats, and suddenly he was the face of a whole new kind of American cool. He looked like a man who had seen it all and lived to tell the tale. This persona was so strong that it eventually jumped off the album covers and onto the television screen. Kenny started starring in the Gambler TV movies, playing a character named Brady Hawks. He wasn't a trained actor, but it didn't matter. He had that natural charisma that made you want to watch him. Those movies were massive hits, and they lasted for years. For a whole generation of people, Kenny Rogers wasn't just a singer, he was a Western hero. He was the guy who could outsmart the bad guys at a card table and then sing a ballad that would make you cry. He was building a bridge between music, film, and personality that made him one of the most recognizable faces in the world. But the brand didn't stop at acting. Kenny was a businessman through and through. He knew that the music industry could be fickle, so he diversified. He started a restaurant chain called Kenny Rogers Roasters, which became famous in its own right, even getting its own plotline on Seinfeld. He got into photography, publishing books of high-end portraits that showed he had a real eye for art. He even had his own line of Western wear for a while. Everything he touched seemed to turn to gold because people trusted him. He had this honest neighbor vibe that made you feel like if he put his name on something, it had to be good. He was one of the first artists to really understand how to market himself as a lifestyle, not just a voice. Despite all the business deals and the movie sets, he never let the gambler persona become a joke. He took it seriously. He understood that people looked to him for a sense of stability and comfort. In a world that was changing fast, Kenny was a constant. He was the guy who stayed true to his sound and his look. Even when he was doing high-production shows in Las Vegas with glitz and glamour, he still felt like that guy from the Houston housing projects. He had this way of making a massive arena feel like a small living room. That was his real talent. He could sell a brand to millions without ever losing the individual connection with the person sitting in the back row. Of course, maintaining that kind of fame takes a toll. He was working constantly, touring the world, filming movies and running businesses. He was always on. He once said that he didn't want to be the guy who stayed at the party too long, but he also didn't know how to stop. The gambler persona was a gift, but it was also a lot to carry. Every time he stepped out in public, he had to be that wise, silver-haired legend. He handled it with a lot of grace, but as the years went on, the weight of being a global brand started to show. He was playing a high-stakes game with his time and his health, and for a long time it looked like he was winning every hand. But even the best players eventually have to fold their cards. The long goodbye. The end didn't happen all at once. It was more like a slow fade. For a guy who had spent 60 years moving at 100 miles an hour, Slowing down was the hardest part. By 2015, Kenny knew the clock was ticking on his time as a performer. He announced his farewell tour, calling it the Gambler's Last Deal. He wanted to go around the world one last time to say thank you to the people who had bought his records and filled those arena seats for decades. But as the tour went on, it became clear that his body wasn't keeping up with his spirit. He was having trouble walking, and he often had to perform while sitting on a stool. He didn't like it. He was a guy who wanted to give a full show, but the fans didn't care. They just wanted to be in the same room as him one more time. In 2017, he had that massive farewell concert in Nashville. It was a star-studded night, and the emotional peak was, of course, his last public performance with Dolly Parton. They sang Islands in the Stream, and at the end, they both literally dropped their microphones and walked off stage together. It was supposed to be the perfect rock star ending. But behind the scenes, Kenny was struggling more than he let on. Not long after that, he had to cancel the remaining dates of his tour. His doctors told him he needed to focus on recuperation, which is a nice way of saying his body was finally giving out. He moved to Georgia to live a quieter life, away from the flash bulbs and the travel. Those final years were spent mostly out of the public eye. There were rumors, of course, tabloids saying he was on death's door, or that he had lost his mind, but his team kept things private. He was dealing with a lot: mobility issues, bladder cancer, and the general wear and tear of a life lived on the road. He wasn't the gambler anymore. He was a father and a husband trying to make the most of the time he had left with his wife Wanda and their twin boys. He wanted them to have memories of him that weren't just about the music. He wanted to be a dad. But even in that quiet life, the music never really stopped calling to him. Then came the final hospital stay in early 2020. He was 81 years old, and he knew he wasn't going to be walking out of there. That's when that heavy atmosphere from the beginning of our story set in. He was tired, he was weak, but he had that one last duet to finish. It wasn't about fame anymore, it was about closure. Recording that final song in a hospital bed was his way of making sure he didn't leave anything on the table. He had lived his life by the rules of the song that made him famous. He knew when to hold them, and he finally knew when it was time to fold. When he passed away in March 2020, the world felt a little quieter. The man was gone, but he had made sure his last word was a song. The Echo. Kenny Rogers' life was like one of his songs. It had a clear beginning, a middle full of drama, and a final chorus that stayed with you long after the music stopped. From the housing projects of Houston to the neon lights of Las Vegas, he lived a life that most people can only dream of. But what makes him stay in our hearts isn't the money, the gold records, or the awards piled up on his shelves. It's the fact that through every decade and every change in style, he always felt real. He was the guy who looked you in the eye and told you a story that made you feel a little less alone in your own struggles. Even in that final heartbreaking hospital recording, he was still being honest with us. He didn't try to hide his weakness or use technology to pretend he was still the young, powerful man from the 70s. He let the world hear the rasp, the effort, and the truth of a man at the end of his journey. In doing that, he gave his fans one last lesson. He showed us that there is dignity in being fragile, and that there is a special kind of bravery in saying goodbye when you know the time is right. Most stars want to be remembered only at their peak, but Kenny was okay with us seeing him as he was, a human being who had given everything he had to his craft. The image of him propped up in that sterile room, surrounded by machines, but focused entirely on the melody, is the perfect final image for his legacy. It tells us that for Kenny, the music wasn't just a job or a way to get famous. It was his oxygen. He needed to get those notes out one last time because that's how he communicated with the world. He started his career in a band. He made his biggest marks standing next to friends like Dolly. And he ended his life sharing a song with someone else. He was never a man who wanted to stand alone, and that's why so many people feel like they lost a friend when he passed. The gambler finally folded his hand in March 2020, but he didn't lose the game. He won because he left behind a body of work that spans generations. Whether it's a grandmother listening to Lady or a young kid hearing The Gambler for the first time on a road trip, his voice is still there, steady and warm. That hospital room recording serves as the final amen to a massive, beautiful career. It reminds us that while the body might give out, the songs we leave behind have a life of their own. Kenny Rogers is gone, but the echo of that final duet still hangs in the air. A quiet reminder that he played his cards exactly the way they were meant to be played. Kenny Rogers was more than just a voice. He was the soundtrack to our lives. From the projects to the hospital room, he never stopped sharing his soul. If you loved this deep dive into the gambler's final journey, make sure to subscribe for more stories about music's greatest legends.